Let's recap the three types of 7th chord that you're likely to encounter in popular music. They are a straight 7th, a minor 7th, and a major 7th chord. Now, of course, there are other types of 7th chord. You have diminished 7th, half diminished 7th, minor major 7th you get in jazz, and so on. But those first three that I mentioned are the only ones you're likely to encounter in popular music. And even if you're playing classical and jazz, they're by far and away the most common type of 7th chord. So they're worth learning really well, and you should be able to tell the difference between them really easily. So the first one was what I'm calling a straight 7th. So by far and away the most common type of 7th chord in any kind of Western music really is a major triad, but with a minor 7th. So major triad, but a 7th that's a tone less than an octave. So in this case I'm playing one on G, so this would be written G7. G with a 7 higher than the G. As it happens, a 7th chord on G is the only one that's all white. If you played C7, it would look like this, F7 looks like this. G7 is the only one that's all white. So major triad, minor 7th. Now this is sometimes called a dominant 7th, especially if you're reading a theory book. You might hear this described as a dominant 7th chord. The word dominant implies that the chord is being built on the 5th note of the scale. So in this case, if we're in C major, 5th note of the scale is G. So it makes sense if you're playing in G major to call it a dominant 7th. But if you're playing blues, you can have a 7th chord like that on the 1st note of the scale, or the 4th note of the scale, as well as the 5th. So I think that the word dominant in this case is a classical term that's getting applied to popular music in a confusing way, so I don't like using it. I'll just call this a straight 7th chord, or just a 7th. If you hear someone say play a 7th chord, they probably mean a chord with a major triad, but a minor 7th. So I spent a bit of time on that one because it's by far and away the most common, but luckily the other two types of 7th chord are easier. Next up is the minor 7th chord. Minor triad, minor 7th. So remember that the 7th by default is minor. So in the phrase G minor 7, the word minor is referring to the triad. And that's reflected in the way that it's usually written. This would usually be written GM7, M for minor, and the M would be on the same level as the G. So you'd have G, M, and then 7 higher up. G minor 7. So minor triad, minor 7th. And the minor in G minor 7 is referring to the triad. We'll come back to that in a bit. Let's do major 7ths first. This is G major 7. So major triad, major 7th. Now remember as well that our default 7th chord is this, major triad minor 7th. Here we have a major triad major 7th. So what's changed is the 7th. So that means that in the phrase G major 7, the word major this time is referring to the 7th, not to the triad. Our default triad is major, but our default 7th is minor, and we want a major one, so a semitone less than an octave. So this would be G major 7. And again, that's reflected in the way that it's usually written. You would usually write that chord G and then MAJ 7, MAJ for major. But this time the MAJ would be higher up, so you'd have a G here, then MAJ higher up, and 7 at the top, showing that the major is referring to the 7th. So G minor 7, the minor is referring to the triad. G major 7, the major is referring to the 7th. Now if that's confusing, there's a way to simplify it, which is just to notice that in a minor 7th chord, both the triad and the 7th are minor. So in a minor 7th chord, everything's minor. Whereas in a major 7th chord, both the triad and the 7th are major. So in a major 7th chord, everything is major, triad and 7th. So that, I think, really simplifies things. It's therefore quite easy to remember how to build a minor 7th chord on different notes, and it's quite easy to remember how to build a major 7th chord on different notes. So the only one which is slightly tricky is this one, the straight 7th. Major triad, minor 7th. So just learn this one really, really well. It's going to crop up all the time. Most of the time you have a 7th chord, it'll be major triad, minor 7th. So learn that on every note of the scale.